We are loading. Okay. So we are now live on YouTube for all eternity. And I'm going to tweet out the link in which you are tagged, so feel free to retweet it or not. I
Oh,
always
I'll be tweeting it.
Okay. I always make sure to invite everybody, including the losers and the haters. So they might be joining us. Okay. So the basic premise for this conversation is foreign policy, Obama's legacy, and tangentially the presidential election, which is sort of the unavoidable bear in the room, right? Now that we're just over a month out. So, in framing the conversation, one thing that occurred, one question that occurred to me to pose to you as sort of a starting point is, if you had a time machine, and you could go to, say, January of 2008, and you could let one of Obama's newly energized, hopeful Democratic primary voters, let's say it's a 25-year-old who is sick of George W. Bush, if you could let him or her know that in October of 2016, under Obama's watch or at his discretion, the United States would now be at war in Syria, at war in Iraq. So Iraq War 3.0 is upon us. Now, I guess, supposedly the invasion of Mosul is imminent, although it has been for a long time now, it seems. There's another invasion or airstrike campaign in Libya that's gotten shockingly little attention. Funding the Saudi proxy war in Yemen to disastrous effect, as you know. Ukraine is still a mess, and relations with Russia are at a new low. And then you have even issues with China and the South China Sea that I don't have to admit I don't personally know enough about to comment on intelligently. But that's happening supposedly. So in totality, we are not really at a place where that hopeful 25-year-old might have predicted we might be at back in January of 2008.
And that's forgetting Somalia, even, where we're also bombing. So
right. I know I probably forgot one.
It's hard to keep track of all the countries where the United States is making some form of war these days. Absolutely.
So how would you explain what has transpired to that Obama voter back in January 2008?
Making that sound that Japanese men, when they're asked a hard question, that sucking sound.
Didn't Ross Perot make a giant sucking sound too? Remember that?
The giant sucking sound, yeah.
That was how he explained. That was how he explained jobs going overseas. There was a giant sucking sound in '92 or something like that. Anyway, go on.
I mean, how to explain that? It takes so much more than one president. Even a dynamic president, especially sort of a half-committed president, to changing and reorienting American statecraft when so many forces are pushing us deeper and deeper into various wars throughout the world, especially in the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, and with pressures pushing us elsewhere around the globe too. It's the structure, it's the institutions, it's much more than the president that makes this difference. And it's also political movements that either do or do not exist that are shaping the political environment in American statecraft. You can't put your faith in any kind of single leader, charismatic or uncharismatic. And it's important to be very skeptical of any promises made without deeds and force to back it up. Force can be not just military force, but political force to extricate the United States from various wars, and force can be diplomatic force and power wielded to solve problems politically around the world. So I don't know, that's not a very inspiring or catchy message for this hypothetical 25-year-old, but there it is.
Yeah. It just seems like, if you had told that prototypical Obama 20-something voter in 2008 that this would be the state of affair 8 years later, it seems it would have caused sort of a crisis, an existential crisis for them, right? Because one of the main reasons why Obama himself, and I take the point that it's a little it's not really fruitful to focus inordinately on one particular charismatic leader. But at the same time, the promise of Obama at that period was that he would be a break from the bipartisan foreign policy orthodoxy in some sense. Maybe it was incorrect for that to be assigned to him, but it nevertheless was. In contrast with Hillary Clinton and in contrast with George W. Bush. So I can imagine, if you had that time machine, it would provoke something of a existential crisis for that person, because they would have thought that the main reason why they had gravitated to this candidacy was false. I don't know. And go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, this orthodoxy that is interventionist, maximalist, very control freaky, insisting on maximum American involvement in the world's affairs, especially military involvement. This is much more than a neoconservative thing. It's much broader than that. It's much more than a hawk Republican thing. And it's nothing so new either. I think looking back, we see clearly that it's too easy to have blamed the Iraq invasion just on neocons. I mean, start with the fact that the Iraq invasion was supported by Bill and by Hillary, by Joe Lieberman, that Al Gore's dissent from it was really not very ringing.
And John Kerry.
And John Kerry too. So this idea that it was just the wicked Bush Cheney gang that led the nation astray away from our true selves, that's very wishful. And look at the main orthodox critique of U.S. foreign policy now. It's not what you and I are getting at, that there's too much war making and too much needless military intervention. The most dominant critique of Obama that you see now is that he didn't do enough war making, that he should have bombed Assad in Syria earlier in 2012 or later, and that he really wimped out there, and that the Syrian civil war there is his fault. I want to question this a little bit by way of comparison. Now, looking at a really bloody foreign civil war where U.S. president did nothing, and whether or not this is a blot on that U.S. president, let's look at the Second Congo War, which raged from 1998 to 2003 and killed, according to one credible academic estimate, 5.4 million people, involved 9 countries. The U.S. did not intervene militarily. And yet to connect this to Bill Clinton's legacy or George W. Bush's legacy seems not just counterintuitive, but even a bit absurd. I mean, what are you doing? How can you say that the civil war in Congo is in any way Bill Clinton's fault or Bush Cheney's fault? And yet we're doing something very similar if we blame Barack Obama for the Syrian civil war. It assumes a degree of American omnipotence, for one thing, that the president with a bag of human rights lightning bolts could just solve the problem with some sorties and some drone strikes, and it's only that Obama's negligence or selfishness or wimpishness that has allowed this problem. That's a very egocentric way to look at it, but that's the dominant way of Beltway think tanks and the Beltway political culture to look at this problem. And we really have to ask, is the United States the center of the world? What's different? And what's the same between the Second Congo War, which was bloody and horrible and killed millions, yet no one blames on Presidents Clinton or Bush Cheney, and the Syrian civil war now, which is bloody and horrible, and yet there's a very strong tendency among opinion elites in this country to blame on President Obama.
Yeah, I think that's a really illustrative counterfactual, because obviously the what would jump out to me as the main point of divergence there between those two conflicts is that, Central Africa or South Central Africa is not seen as a vital region for American national interest, right? Rightly or wrongly, that's seen as in the Middle East, and there's this group, ISIS, that is now taken hold in parts of the Middle East that is somehow seen as an existential threat to United States national security by some alarmists, elite opinion makers. But another something that came to mind as well when you drew out that contrast is that Obama, for all his faults in the foreign policy arena, and there have been many, and we could lay them out here at great length, he has, in some sense, been a bulwark against the so-called blob, right, or the prevailing foreign policy orthodoxies, which are maximalist in all cases for the most part. For the most, I think the best example in that regard is probably Ukraine, where Obama, pretty much alone amongst foreign policy elites, has resisted calls to arm the so-called opposition there, and therefore antagonize Russia even more than they're already antagonized, and possibly precipitate an even more expansive conflict on that front. So that seems like somewhat of a paradox, right?
Yeah, I mean, the question is has Obama been a retrenchment president, or has he been another war-making president with lots of continuity from Bush and Cheney, as we were saying earlier, with, I think, accurately. I was at the Council of Foreign Relations for some lunchtime panel discussion a couple weeks ago. A friend of mine who teaches the history of U.S. foreign relations in the UK, a British guy, was speaking on the panel. And it was interesting. I mean, there was a wide variety of opinions about whether Obama, is he like Eisenhower, curtailing the American military force and military industrial complex, or and what does this mean? I mean, there was one questioner in the Q&A who seemed visibly agitated, and she wanted to know why Obama had allowed the Brexit vote, meaning that the Brexit vote was somehow Obama's doing. And
I thought that was Putin's fault.
Well, okay, I guess there's blame to spread there, but it was left to my British friend to very calmly explain to this questioner that maybe Obama, it was not wise of him to speak out against the Brexit vote, but that was far from decisive, and that not everything that happens in the world is because of something that happens in Washington.
Or London in that case.
Or that, I mean, it's very interesting. I think that perceptions of foreign policy and America's place in the world is to a large degree shaped not by the reality that's out there, but shaped and really subordinate to American domestic politics. And that there has been a very strong effort to Jimmy Carterize President Obama and paint him as some wimpy guy who's just wringing his hands on the sidelines instead of rolling up his sleeves and throwing punches. And this is in spite of, as we were saying earlier, major escalation in Afghanistan, where the majority of the deaths of U.S. forces in that country are under Obama's watch, not under Bush and Cheney's. A Libya war with pretty terrible results, drone strikes in half a dozen countries. And despite this highly interventionist record, you have Pulitzer Prize winning foreign policy pundits like Bret Stephens at the Wall Street Journal accusing Obama of being not just not a maximalist, but even being a, quote, isolationist. And can that word have any meaning? I mean, you hear that always in an accusatory way, that word, that label, isolationist, bandied about and slapped on political leaders who are not, bloody-minded enough, who are not, pro-war enough, but the fact that Obama, with I think a record that is not very good or not a credit to him of constant military intervention, with some notable acts of restraint, as you said, both in refusing to start bombing Syria and Assad in 2012, in restraining the foreign policy blob in Ukraine, and also with the Iran deal, is still a very interventionist, maximalist record.
Yeah, and it should be noted that every step along the way when Obama has taken an action that is militaristic or interventionist, Hillary Clinton has always been the pulling him toward that end of the spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. So when she was Secretary of State, she was obviously one of the prime agitators for the Libya intervention. Mm-hmm. She was one of the prime agitators for taking a more aggressive posture toward the Syria conflict. Mm-hmm. And actually, even though she was out of office in 2013, in August of 2013, when Obama proposed strikes against Assad, she issued a statement saying that she supported that course of action, even though he put it to Congress and it ultimately wasn't taken to fruition. Mm-hmm. Something that I've been thinking about recently in that regard is that there's been a ton of media fascination, I would say to the point of obsession, over the pathologies internal to the Republican Party coalition. Mm-hmm. So what factors gave rise to Trump? That's a legitimate question to ask, and it will be asked and contemplated for a very long time. Mm-hmm. But it seems like there's been comparatively less scrutiny of the pathologies that gave rise to Hillary within mm-hmm. the Democratic Party coalition, given that she was one of the, it wasn't just that she voted for the Iraq War in October of 2002, mm-hmm. right? And that she campaigned on it she campaigned for the entirety of the 2008 campaign against Obama on that vote having been proper. She then agitated for several more mm-hmm. horrible military interventions that caused mass death and destruction. And she didn't actually repudiate that vote until 2014, when she released her highly unmemorable memoir called Hard Choices. So I guess one of the hard choices was to wait 12 years to admit that the vote was a mistake, right? So it just seems like there hasn't been sufficient attention paid to why the Democratic standard bearer is now one of the foremost Iraq War agitators. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mm-hmm. seem to interest or fascinate the media as much as whatever Trump versus Cruz mm-hmm. thing is happening, right?
Yeah, I mean, to look at the rise of Trump, I think foreign policy has very little to do with it. I mean, among Republican primary voters. But that aside, yeah, I think we should look at the pathologies of the Democratic Party and its political culture too. And it's not just their number one celebrity, Hillary Clinton. It's also Chuck Schumer, someone else who voted for the Iraq invasion. And he's going to be the third Democratic Party Senate leader in a row who voted for the Iraq invasion. So did Harry Reid. So did his predecessor, I think, was it Tom Daschle, who was Senate Majority Leader then. Yep. So clearly there hasn't been much of a price to pay in the Democratic Party at all for supporting the Iraq War. I mean, you can look at Obama. I think that he would never have become president had he not been on record opposing the Iraq War. That's what gave him, I think, a critical amount of momentum, among some other things, too, in the primaries of 2008. Had Obama been mushy on the war or been in favor of the war, I don't think he would have won that primary or come close to it. So there's been some small price to pay there. Hillary's nomination postponed, but by 8 years. But yeah, I mean, why is this? I mean, to step back and just look at American political culture in general, I think ever since 1973, when Nixon does away with the draft, foreign policy and war making becomes something very abstract without much of a visceral connection. And when corpses start coming home and Americans start dying, it's usually not the sons and occasionally daughters of political, media, nonprofit elites, academic elites. And it's just not even felt. I mean, the draft clearly did not stop the much bigger bloodbath in Southeast Asia that we had a generation and a half ago. But there was a strong anti-war movement, and there was more skepticism among American opinion elites because there was at least the theoretical possibility that little Junior could be sent to, the rice paddies to kill and perhaps to die. But what we have now is a degree of war making that is much more uncoupled from politics. And not only is there no draft and it's a volunteer army, but you got a tax cut as well with Bush and Cheney, who invaded two countries and gave you a tax cut along with it.
And just to interject briefly, those opinion elites back during the Vietnam era also knew that there were various roundabout methods of avoiding the draft if you had a certain status, right? So you get an educational deferment, and people as varied as Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Mitt Romney, all took advantage of this, right?
Yeah, Cheney, but both sides of the aisle, and including our new favorite guy, Donald Trump. So there's that, and then if you add, one, as if that wasn't far removed enough from small r Republican values of, the entire citizenry sacrificing for war, whether through, paying in money or risking young people's lives for it, you have drone strikes that are possible, completely far removed, literally far removed from the battlefield, where the controllers of these aircraft face no risk. And so it's as if you've disconnected the brakes to the entire system. And that's something that has happened. I don't know, maybe that's too passive a way to put it. That's something that the Obama presidency has done, has cemented this into place. And it's hard to see, certainly President Hillary Clinton undoing this. I think everyone expects her to be even more hawkish than Obama. I don't see Donald Trump, should he become president, putting the brakes on this either. I know he's spoken really on both sides of every recent war, and occasionally some pundits who are, lean towards anti-war are optimistic. But I don't put much stock in Trump's anti-war statements, and here's why. First of all, when presidential candidates are campaigning, what they promise in terms of foreign policy very often has nothing to do with how they actually exercise power. And this is both for good and for ill. Eisenhower campaigned in 1952 as a real hawk, someone who had rolled back communism in Eastern Europe. He had his attack dogs, John Foster Dulles, out there saying some very hair-raising things. But then he is a relatively dovish president, settling for imperialism on the cheap, small-scale covert interventions in Guatemala, in Iran, but he's not interested in fighting proxy wars, much less a full-scale confrontation with the Soviet Union. And then you have the flip side of that with George W. Bush campaigning on a more humble foreign policy in 2000, explicitly promising that the U.S. would not get involved in nation building again. And then look what he did. So you have to be very skeptical of those claims. So I don't think that anything Trump says, and even though he's speaking on both sides of this in terms of being more dovish, being more reluctant to use force, in some cases, although he says the opposite in others, really means very much. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think, broadly I agree with you just in terms of being skeptical of campaign rhetoric versus what the actual governing approach tends to be. However, I think there's, as with much of that has to do with Trump, there's a little bit of a liberal self-contradiction in the way that he has been interpreted, right? Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, they'll put it a little more crudely than you just did, but they'll say, you can't trust anything Trump says, he's a con man, he's a clown, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, fine. But then they'll use other statements of his to indicate that he's some ideological, even a racist in some senses. So not only that he says bigoted things sometimes, which is undoubtedly true, they'll impute ideological white nationalism to him based on some joke that he made 10 years ago or some stupid remark that he made in the heat of some campaign speech somewhere a month ago, right? Yeah, at the same time, they'll say, even where you can detect consistencies in his rhetoric over the years, those should be, and they indicate some measure of anti-interventionism, those should be immediately discounted. So, say he had, no, I don't think anybody would deny that there have been contradictions in what he said over the years because he's a pundit. I mean, he didn't enter official positions into the public record as, say, Hillary Clinton has. So, if he's on Howard Stern in 2002 and he says, maybe it would be a good idea to possibly invade Iraq, and then later on comes out a little more vociferously against it, is that a flip-flop, or is that just some guy who's like a amateur pundit kind of, kind of crudely thinking through some issues that he's not an expert on? I don't know. I think, you can, if you go back to the 80s, you could see him talking at length about the U.S. getting ripped off by having all these bases all over the place and not getting anything substantial in return. So I do encourage skepticism of him, just as I would encourage skepticism of other candidates. But I think there's a little bit of a disconnect in the prevailing view of what he might represent. I mean, he hasn't been super consistent on many things, but one thing he has been consistent on throughout the course of the campaign anyway is trying to achieve some semblance of détente with Russia. Now that's taken as some kind of horrifying, intolerable endorsement of Putin, right? But it probably, so just minor gradations in difference between Trump's policy versus Syria, with respect to Syria versus Hillary's policy with respect to Syria, could potentially be so enormous, have such enormous consequences as to avert or initiate a full-scale war, which could blow up into something resembling a world war. I don't want to be hyperbolic about it, but that's potential. That is a potentiality, right? So I don't know. Is that, do you see a little bit of contradiction there in the way that he's perceived?
Well, I agree with you in the contradictory evidentiary standards that many liberals bring to talking about Donald Trump. And I mean, I'll show my cards. I really don't like the guy. I hope he doesn't become president. One of the many things I dislike about him is that he has contaminated with his touch some good general ideas, like, as you were saying, détente with Russia. That is a good thing. I think recalibrating NATO is a good thing that is now somewhat sullied in the American political discourse, where it seldom pops up thanks to Donald Trump talking about it. I do see one risk, though, if Donald Trump becomes president in war with Russia. Now, it's certainly true that Hillary Clinton has backed a more hawkish stance in Ukraine that can lead to, putting us on the brink. And I'm not, wiping that out or ignoring that. But major conflicts, great power conflicts, are often caused by miscommunication, where the kind of détente, the balance of power, breaks down because there are false signals sent. One of the reasons that Iraq invaded Kuwait, a strong case can be made for, is because the U.S. ambassador, April Glaspie, to Iraq said, we don't see this as a really important thing. She gave kind of false signals. North Korea invades South Korea, also in partial response to signals sent by the Truman administration that we don't really see this as a core U.S. interest or that significant. There were many false signals sent and bad communication sent in between European powers that led to a catastrophic European First World War, over the relatively pissant cause of Serbian nationalism. I do see a risk of war with Russia under a Trump presidency, because if he's sending mixed messages to Putin about the Baltic states or about Ukraine, then I can see Putin, let's imagine in 4 years, the price of oil has dipped even lower. He's much less popular. There's unrest in Russia. There's a growing opposition to him. And he thinks maybe a war against, snapping up Latvia or Estonia would help his domestic standing through nationalism. And he thinks that, well, my buddy Trump has been saying that it's not a big deal. Why don't I just take it? This is very hypothetical, but all it takes, for a major conflict to start is some kind of bad risk assessment and mixed communication message and bad signals to be sent.
Yeah, and this is where I think for to a large degree the objections about Trump's supposed temperamental problems have been a little overwrought or a little overemphasized anyway. But this is an area where I do think it could have real disastrous consequences in that he's just not he just bumbles his normal speech, right? So when he's speaking, he can barely complete a sentence coherently a lot of times. So if one adjective or verb is misplaced or mispronounced even, that could potentially be an impetus for some kind of diplomatic crisis, right? And under a Trump presidency, that could be happening every day or every hour, or even like at 2 a.m. on Twitter, right?
In a way, predictability, even if it's a bad predictability, say under a pretty hawkish Hillary Clinton administration, would probably present fewer risks to global, war outbreaking than, as you were saying, someone who, whose temperament makes him very unsuited for statecraft, among other things too, I would say.
Yeah, and I know you got to wrap up relatively soon, but you raised one point maybe about 15 minutes ago that I wanted to just touch on briefly, which is that the incentives within the Democratic Party right now don't seem to penalize Iraq war support as much as they probably ought to, given how disastrous the consequences have been and that we're still dealing with to this very day. And for some, that might seem like just a natural state of affairs where politicians don't pay any price for their bad decisions. But if you look at the UK, the Labour Party has thoroughly repudiated pretty much everybody who had a active role in facilitating that war. Tony Blair is a pariah. And Jeremy Corbyn has now won for the second time an unprecedented mandate to really shift the course in that party, and membership has ballooned under his leadership, and so forth. So it's not as if this is just has to be the accepted state of affairs. Of course, the United Kingdom is not neatly analogous to the United States, and the party systems are quite different. But still, it was a pretty jarring landmark for the composition of the Labour Party to have shifted so dramatically, such that Tony Blair's name can't even be uttered in a Labour Party forum now without an uproar. So I just feel like that should be, the limitations of the analogy bracketed. I think that should be seen as something, as an indication that it doesn't have to be this way, right?
Yeah. Well, I agree with you completely, of course. That's how things should be. They don't have to be the way they are. But I think Democratic Party elites and, up-and-comers in that party, certainly the old guard, they've learned rather the opposite lesson. I mean, going back to Johnson and Kennedy, who are truly responsible for the Vietnam War, instead of repudiating that kind of bellicose nationalism, the figure who Democrats see as the bête noire, the ultimate loser, who you don't want to be like, is George McGovern, who got swept away in a landslide as a peace candidate, as an anti-war candidate in 1972. And the lesson that much of the Democratic Party has learned is this is what happens when you get too close to the hippies, the peaceniks. I mean, this ignores the context of that election, that Nixon was pretty popular. Unemployment was at record low. He had just withdrawn for about 400,000 troops from Vietnam and was clearly winding down that war. I mean, I think even Jesus Christ himself could not have won an election against Nixon in 72. But, Democratic Party elites don't want to know that. Their lesson is stay away from the peace crowd, stay away from the hippies, don't be like George McGovern. When you're in office, be the head liberal in charge, be tough, bomb the hell out of other countries for the fun of it. I give Obama credit where it's due for resisting that in key places, for the Iran deal, for, instead of bombing Assad in the summer of 2012, working out a deal with Putin to withdraw, 130,000 tons of chemical weapons. I think those are good things. And for pursuing a relatively restrained line against Russia and Ukraine, where, well to the left or a much more dovish direction than mainstream Democratic Party pundits are taking, where they're cheering on Hillary for wanting to get tough, in Ukraine against Putin. So, the Democratic Party is clearly pathological, as you were saying earlier. And how do we fix that? And how do we, see that fixed with voter appeal too? I mean, it remains to be seen whether Jeremy Corbyn will be a success or a failure in the Labour Party. I certainly hope it's a success, and I think it's possible, but failure there is also possible.
And, there's an irony here, because you would assume, or you would hope, that the example of Obama being elected and then reelected, by convincing margins in both instances, could have been seen as an excuse to do away with some of those pathologies, right? I mean, that's not to say that he's necessarily a dovish or he was running on an overtly anti-war platform as McGovern might have in 72, but it should have instilled this belief that at least being a little closer to that end of the spectrum was tenable electorally. But it seemed like, the delayed coronation of Hillary Clinton just obviated that. The entire party, virtually every elected official in the country, literally, which is just an amazing thing to contemplate, lined up dutifully behind her, despite the fact that her foreign policy rhetoric was just a throwback to the pre-Obama era, seemingly, in terms of the Democratic standard way of looking at this kind of thing. So it seems like the Hillary nomination and potential presidency seems to indicate that those lessons weren't absorbed.
No, it seems like a regression, in fact, in many ways. But
we shall see, and it will be we'll commiserate together when everything goes haywire. Okay, Chase. Well, it was good to chat with you.
Great chatting with you, Michael. Drink a can of Moxie for me while you're up there in Lewiston, Maine.
I will, and I'll tip over a moose or something.
Tip over a moose. Okay. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Peace. Bye.